I still remember the sound that spray can made, that sharp little hiss cutting through the morning air like somebody opening a snake cage right in front of me. And when I stepped outside with my coffee still in my hand, there it was, bright orange paint running across my fence posts in crooked lines like some kind of crime scene marker. 3 county trucks were parked halfway into the ditch beside my driveway, doors open, engines idling. 2 workers leaning against the tailgate watching me like they already knew how this was going to end. One of them wouldn't even look me in the eye. The other guy kept shaking the spray can like he was enjoying himself a little too much. Now, if you've ever owned rural property in America, especially out in places where county inspectors suddenly decide they care about your existence after ignoring you for 10 straight years, then you already know that orange paint usually means one thing: trouble. Expensive trouble. The inspector walked toward me holding a clipboard against his chest like it gave him authority straight from God himself. Guy's name was Dennis Mercer, mid-50s maybe, stiff posture, polished boots, mirrored sunglasses even though the sky was cloudy. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask questions, didn't even pretend this was a conversation. He just pointed at the fence and said, "You've got 14 days to remove the encroachment." Encroachment. That word hit me harder than I expected because I knew exactly what he was implying. According to the county, I had illegally pushed my fence 10 feet into a public right-of-way, which meant they could force removal, fine me, maybe even bill me for demolition if they decided to make an example out of me. And the wildest part was, that fence hadn't moved an inch in 12 years. I actually laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because the accusation sounded so stupid I honestly thought this had to be some kind of mix-up. I said, "Dennis, that fence was surveyed before it ever went into the ground." He didn't blink, just flipped a page on his clipboard and said, "County records disagree." That's when I started realizing this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. See, I bought that property back in 2011 after my dad passed away. Nothing fancy, just under 4 acres outside the town of Millhaven, old gravel driveway, rusted shed out back, enough room to breathe without hearing your neighbor sneeze through the walls. I poured every spare dollar I had into cleaning that place up. Built the fence myself with my brother over 2 sweaty weekends in August. Steel posts sunk deep, straight line from marker to marker exactly how the surveyor laid it out. I still remember the original surveyor too. Old guy named Raymond Pike, chain smoker, suspenders, talked like every sentence owed him money. He walked the whole boundary with me personally, hammered the property pins into the ground, even painted little yellow caps on top so we wouldn't miss them while setting posts. We followed those pins exactly, every single one, and for 12 years nobody said a word. Not the county, not the neighbors, not the utility company, nobody. Then all of a sudden this man shows up acting like I personally invaded federal land. I asked him if he had a copy of the updated survey they were using, and he gave me this little smirk, not a friendly smile either, one of those thin, smug expressions people get when they think procedure automatically makes them right. He tapped the clipboard with his pen and said, "Sir, the county GIS system places your boundary approximately 10 feet west of the current fence line." Approximately. That word mattered. Because people who actually know land disputes don't talk in approximations unless they're guessing. I told him I still had my original documents, and he shrugged like it didn't matter. Then he handed me a folded notice covered in legal wording and deadlines and potential penalties. Big bold text across the top, read notice of right-of-way violation. Real dramatic stuff. Meanwhile, the guy with the spray can kept marking posts every 20 feet like they were planning a demolition schedule. And that's when my neighbor Wade decided to wander over from across the road. Now Wade Callahan was one of those men who somehow always appeared whenever conflict started, like God put him on earth specifically to supervise other people's problems. Retired insurance adjuster, perfectly trimmed beard, polo shirts tucked into jeans for absolutely no reason. He walked over carrying a mug of coffee with this fake concerned expression and said, "Everything all right over here?" Dennis answered before I could. "Just correcting a property line issue. And I swear to you." Wade smiled. Tiny little smile, barely there, but enough. That was the moment something clicked in my head. Because 6 months earlier Wade and I had argued over drainage runoff after he hired contractors to raise part of his lot. Rainwater started flooding toward my side whenever storms rolled through, and after I complained to the county about erosion near the ditch, Wade stopped waving at me after that. Real mature stuff. So now I'm standing there watching orange paint go up on my fence while my neighbor pretends to casually sip coffee 10 feet away. And suddenly this whole situation starts smelling less like a clerical error and more like somebody making phone calls behind closed doors. Still, I kept my mouth shut. That part's important. Because people make mistakes the second authority figures start pushing buttons. They yell, threaten lawsuits, start recording TikToks in their driveway. And the minute you lose emotional control, you become the problem instead of the paperwork. So I asked Dennis one more time if he could show me the actual map. He said, "You'll receive documentation through the county office." Translation? He didn't have it. Then he pointed toward the orange paint and told me, "I'd advise you to begin removal immediately. These cases tend to become expensive once enforcement escalates." There it was. The pressure tactic. The little reminder that government agencies know most people can't afford long disputes. Honestly, that line irritated me more than the notice itself. Because according to standard procedure, county inspectors are supposed to verify physical survey markers before issuing enforcement actions involving boundary encroachments, especially in older rural parcels where GIS overlays can drift several feet, depending on map calibration. Anybody who actually works around land records knows digital parcel layers are reference tools, not gospel. But Dennis talked like the computer map had descended from Mount Sinai carved into stone tablets. I watched them finish spraying the remaining posts before climbing back into their trucks. Gravel spit out behind the tires as they pulled away, leaving those ugly orange marks glowing against the steel like warning lights. Wade lingered a little longer. Of course he did. He took another sip from his mug and said, "County usually doesn't make mistakes on things like this." I looked at him and said, "Funny timing though, huh?" That fake smile disappeared immediately. Then he muttered something about regulations and walked back across the road. I stood there alone for a minute after that, staring at the fence line stretching across the edge of my property, and I'm not gonna lie. For a second, I actually felt sick. Because even when you know you're right, there's something deeply unsettling about receiving official paperwork telling you your land suddenly doesn't belong to you anymore. That's the psychological side nobody talks about. People assume property ownership feels permanent until somebody in authority challenges it. Then suddenly, you start second-guessing your own memory, your own documents, your own reality. And trust me, Dennis knew that. Guys like him count on hesitation. They count on people folding early because legal language sounds expensive. So I walked back into the house, set the violation notice on the kitchen counter, and started pulling old file boxes out of the hallway closet. Dust everywhere. Receipts. Tax records, insurance papers. Then finally, the survey folder. Brown envelope, folded corners, my handwriting across the front. Fence install, 2011. The second I opened it, I already felt calmer. Because unlike Dennis Mercer and his magical disappearing property line, I had something stronger than assumptions. I had records, stamped survey documents, coordinate data, photos from installation day, and somewhere deep in my gut, a little voice kept whispering the same thing over and over. If they were really right about this, why did nobody notice for 12 years? That question stayed in my head the whole night, while rain started tapping against the windows outside, and I spread documents across the dining room table one piece at a time. At first I was just trying to organize evidence in case things got ugly, but then I remembered something that changed everything. The county had upgraded their online GIS mapping system 2 years earlier. Meaning if Dennis was relying on digital parcel overlays instead of physical survey verification, there was a chance his own system could expose him. And once that thought entered my head, I stopped feeling nervous. I started feeling curious. Now let me pause the story for a second because this part right here, this is where a lot of homeowners get completely steamrolled, not because they're wrong, but because they panic before they understand the game being played. And trust me, counties, HOAs, code enforcement offices, they all understand something about human psychology that most regular people don't. They know official paperwork scares people. Doesn't even matter if the paperwork is correct. The second somebody sees words like violation, enforcement action, or civil penalty, their brain immediately jumps to worst-case scenarios. This is a psychological trap because fear makes people comply faster than facts do. Most folks will start tearing down fences, trimming trees, paying fines, whatever the notice says, before they ever ask a very simple question. Can they actually prove it? And honestly, half the time, they can't. or at least not as confidently as they pretend to. According to standard procedure, GIS parcel maps are usually considered reference tools, not legally binding surveys. That's important. Counties use them because they're fast and convenient, but digital overlays can drift several feet depending on old easements, bad calibration, outdated aerial imagery, or clerical updates nobody double-checks. From a legal perspective, physical survey markers, recorded plats, and stamped surveys almost always carry more weight than somebody pointing at a screen in a county office. But here's where it gets interesting. People like Dennis rarely expect resistance from organized homeowners. They expect emotion. They expect yelling. They expect somebody dumb enough to threaten a lawsuit in the driveway while they quietly document hostile behavior in their notes. What they do not expect is calm paperwork. That changes the power dynamic immediately. Because the second you produce organized records, timelines, photos, survey pins, county parcel history, suddenly the conversation stops being intimidation and starts becoming liability. And counties hate liability. The lesson here is simple. If somebody in authority pressures you to act fast before showing evidence, slow down. Calm people with documentation are dangerous to bureaucracies built on assumptions. So after that little realization hit me, I stopped looking at the situation like a homeowner defending a fence and started looking at it like a man trying to figure out where the lie entered the system. Because somebody was wrong here, and I had a feeling the county didn't accidentally wake up one Tuesday morning and discover my property line had magically shifted 10 feet overnight. I sat there at the dining room table until almost midnight with papers spread everywhere around me like some low-budget detective movie. Rain kept hitting the windows. The old ceiling fan rattled overhead, and every few minutes I'd compare another document against the violation notice Dennis left behind. The survey matched the deed. The deed matched the parcel dimensions. The parcel dimensions matched the original county filing from 1998. Everything lined up. Everything except Dennis. That's when I logged into the county GIS website. Now, if you've never used one of those systems before, imagine Google Maps designed by people who actively resent happiness. Tiny buttons, weird layers, loading times from 2006. Real government excellence. But eventually I got the parcel overlay open and found my property. Then I turned on the right-of-way layer. And there it was. At first glance, it looked exactly like Dennis claimed. The highlighted access corridor cut close to my fence line. But something fell off immediately because the alignment didn't match the parcel geometry underneath it. So I zoomed in farther. Then farther. Then all the way down until the image started pixelating. And suddenly I saw the problem. The right-of-way line wasn't following the legal parcel edge at all. It was offsetting from the road center line incorrectly, almost like somebody had dragged the layer sideways years ago, and nobody noticed afterward. I actually leaned back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, because the entire case against me suddenly looked unbelievably sloppy. The county's own GIS map contradicted the enforcement notice. Their own data exposed the mistake. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. I started overlaying screenshots side by side with my survey coordinates. Every angle told the same story. The fence wasn't encroaching onto public land. The digital map layer itself was misaligned, which meant Dennis either never verified the physical survey markers, or he did and ignored them. Neither option made him look great. So now the whole emotional atmosphere changed. 30 minutes earlier, I'd been sitting there stressed about losing part of my property. Now I was irritated. Because if I hadn't kept records, if I'd been older, less organized, less stubborn, they probably would have bulldozed that fence without ever checking twice. That part bothered me more than anything. People trust official confidence way too easily, and authority figures know it. I kept digging through the GIS system for another hour and eventually found archived parcel imagery from older county datasets. Sure enough, the older versions aligned almost perfectly with my survey line. The newer update was where everything shifted. Bingo. At that point, I could have gone nuclear if I wanted to. Lawyers, public complaints, county meetings, whole dramatic crusade. But honestly, I've lived long enough to understand something important about bureaucracies. Most conflicts are won quietly. Embarrass somebody privately before you embarrass them publicly, and 9 times out of 10, they'll help you make the problem disappear. So instead of calling Dennis angry at midnight like some lunatic, I opened a clean email draft. No emotional language. No threats. No insults. Just facts. I attached the original stamped survey. Photos from installation day showing the survey pins before construction. Close-up images of the steel post alignment. Screenshots from the county GIS overlay. Then I highlighted the visible offset inconsistency between the parcel layer and right-of-way layer. That was it. Short email. Professional tone. Almost cold. The subject line simply read, "Request for verification. Right-of-way encroachment notice." And here's the important part. I didn't send it only to Dennis. I CC'd his supervisor and the county records office. Because according to standard procedure, once multiple departments become aware of a potential mapping discrepancy tied to enforcement action, the liability exposure changes dramatically. Suddenly, this isn't just one inspector pressuring a homeowner anymore. Now there's a digital paper trail proving the county was informed before taking further action. That matters. A lot. I hit send around 1:12 in the morning. Then I went to bed. Well, technically I laid in bed staring at the ceiling for 6 straight hours pretending to sleep while my brain replayed every possible outcome imaginable. Because confidence sounds great in storytelling videos, but in real life, even when you know you're right, there's still that little voice wondering if somebody bigger than you can simply decide otherwise. That's the ugly truth about power. It doesn't always need to be correct to make your life miserable. Morning came gray and cold. I made coffee, pulled on my boots, and walked outside expecting absolutely nothing. Then I froze halfway down the porch steps. The orange paint was gone. Every single mark. Gone. At first I thought maybe the rain washed it off during the night. But no, this wasn't faded paint. Somebody had physically removed it. The posts looked scrubbed clean. I stood there staring at the fence line like I was hallucinating. No county trucks. No warning notices. No workers. Nothing. Just silence. And honestly, that silence told me more than any apology ever could. Because if they truly believed I was violating public right-of-way regulations, there's no universe where they quietly erase enforcement markings overnight without explanation. Government offices don't suddenly become shy when they know they're right. No, what happened was somebody higher up finally opened the attachments in my email. That's what happened. Some supervisor probably zoomed into the same GIS overlay, saw the same offset issue, realized the inspector never physically verified the survey markers, and immediately understood how ugly this could become if lawyers got involved. Especially because there was now written evidence proving the county had been notified before enforcement escalation. See, this is the part people misunderstand about bureaucracies. Most agencies aren't evil mastermind organizations plotting against homeowners in dark rooms somewhere. They're systems filled with overworked people trying to close cases quickly. And sometimes speed quietly replaces accuracy. Dennis looked at a digital overlay and decided certainty was easier than verification. Simple as that. The problem for him was, I kept receipts. Around 10 that morning my phone rang. County number. I answered and heard a woman calmly introduce herself as Sandra Bell from the County Records Division. Her voice had that careful professional tone people use when they're trying very hard not to admit somebody screwed up. She said, "Mr. Turner, we're currently reviewing the enforcement notice issued regarding your property boundary." Reviewing. Interesting choice of words. I asked whether the violation still stood. Long pause. Then she said, "At this time, no further action is being requested from the county." That sentence right there? That's government language for "we know this thing's a mess, and we'd like everybody to stop talking now." I asked if they plan to update the record discrepancy. Another pause. Then she said, "The GIS system is informational and may not reflect finalized survey conditions." And I almost laughed directly into the phone because suddenly, the GIS map wasn't reliable anymore. Funny how that works. Yesterday, it was accurate enough to threaten demolition. Today, it was informational. That's bureaucracy in a nutshell. I thanked her politely and hung up. No apology ever came. Dennis never called, never emailed, never returned to the property. Matter of fact, about 3 weeks later, I saw his county truck parked outside a gas station near Route 8. He noticed me pulling in too. For a split second, I thought maybe we'd finally have some kind of awkward conversation. Nope. That man turned around so fast you'd think I was serving subpoenas instead of pumping gas. And honestly, that told me everything I needed to know. Because deep down, guys like Dennis depend on momentum. They move quickly, speak confidently, pressure hard, and count on homeowners surrendering before anyone examines the details too closely. Once somebody interrupts that momentum with evidence, the whole performance starts collapsing. This is a psychological trap a lot of enforcement personalities fall into. Authority becomes part of their identity. So instead of investigating neutrally, they begin defending their initial assumption emotionally. Every challenge feels personal. Every homeowner question sounds like disrespect. That's dangerous. Not because every inspector is corrupt, but because confidence without verification creates collateral damage. And I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't saved those records. What if I trusted the notice automatically? What if I panicked and hired contractors to rip out 12 years of work before checking the map myself? People do that every day. That's the scary part. Not the orange paint. Not the violation notice. The scary part is how easily official certainty can overpower common sense if nobody slows the process down long enough to verify reality. A month later, the county quietly updated the GIS layer online. No announcement. No explanation. The right-of-way alignment suddenly shifted back where it always should have been. Like magic. And if I'm being honest, that tiny silent correction irritated me more than the original accusation. Because somewhere buried inside a county database, there's probably no record acknowledging the homeowners who complied before me. No list of fences unnecessarily moved. No refunds for people intimidated into surrender because they assumed government systems couldn't possibly be wrong. That thought stayed with me. Still does. Sometimes I walk that fence line in the evenings when the sun drops low across the field, and every now and then I'll stop near one of those old steel posts and remember the bright orange paint glowing against it that morning. Funny thing is, the fence never moved. The only thing that shifted was the story wrapped around it. You know what's strange about situations like this? Most people hear a story about property disputes or county enforcement and immediately reduce it to something simple, like good guy versus bad government, or angry homeowner versus clueless inspector. But honestly, real life is usually messier than that. Because the longer I thought about the whole thing afterward, the more I realized the fence was never actually the main issue. Control was. Perception was. Confidence was. And once you notice that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. HOAs do it. County offices do it. Insurance companies do it. Even regular people do it inside neighborhood disputes. The person who sounds the most certain usually gains power first, even before facts enter the conversation. That's why Dennis walked onto my property acting like the decision had already been finalized. The clipboard, the legal wording, the orange paint, the deadlines, all of it created psychological momentum. It pushes people into survival mode. Suddenly homeowners stop thinking critically and start thinking emotionally. How much is this going to cost me? What happens if I refuse? Can they really do this? That fear clouds judgment fast. And the truth is, most systems quietly rely on that reaction. Because from a legal perspective, enforcement pressure works best when people assume resistance is hopeless. Once somebody calmly asks for verification, timelines, source documents, physical survey confirmation, chain of record updates, the emotional advantage starts disappearing. Bureaucracies love speed. Documentation slows them down. That's why organized people make institutions nervous. Not loud people. Not angry people. Organized people. There's a huge difference. See, loud homeowners are easy to dismiss. They become difficult residents. Their emotions get documented. Their reactions become part of the case file. But calm homeowners with folders full of evidence, those people create risk. And risk changes behavior immediately. That's exactly what happened here. The second my email created a paper trail beyond Dennis himself, the county suddenly had accountability attached to the situation. Now supervisors could see the discrepancy. Records departments could see the discrepancy. Meaning if enforcement continued despite contradictory evidence, responsibility would no longer stay hidden inside one inspector's field notes. That changes everything. And honestly, I think that's the lesson a lot of people miss in modern life, especially dealing with authority structures. Most power systems are not nearly as invincible as they appear. They just move faster than average citizens know how to respond. People assume official equals accurate. It doesn't. Official just means somebody stamped paperwork. Now, obviously, I'm not telling people to ignore legitimate violations or turn every county notice into some dramatic rebellion fantasy. Some homeowners absolutely are in the wrong. Some people build fences 20 feet onto easements, then act shocked when consequences show up. That happens too. But this situation reminded me how dangerous blind compliance can become when nobody checks the underlying facts. According to standard procedure, land disputes should involve layered verification. Physical markers, recorded plats, historical surveys, GIS references, easement records, and site inspections. That process exists for a reason. Because property boundaries aren't emotional opinions. They're legal measurements tied to documented history. The problem starts when convenience replaces procedure. And if we're being really honest here, modern systems are drowning in convenience. Digital overlays replace field work. Assumptions replace conversations. Templates replace investigation. Everything moves faster, but accuracy quietly becomes negotiable. That's not just a county problem either. It's cultural. We live in a time where confidence often outruns competence. Whoever speaks first and sounds authoritative usually controls the emotional direction of the situation. Most people never stop long enough to verify whether the foundation underneath that confidence is even real. This is a psychological trap, especially for homeowners, because your house represents stability. It represents safety, identity, control over at least one tiny corner of the world. So when somebody official challenges that space, even incorrectly, it triggers a surprisingly deep emotional response. I felt it myself. That first morning, standing there looking at those orange marks, part of me immediately started imagining worst-case scenarios. Legal bills, forced removal, property value problems, escalation, public records. Even though logically I knew the fence had been surveyed correctly, fear doesn't care about logic at first. That's important to understand. And honestly, that's why I wanted to tell this story at all. Not because of the fence, not because I beat the county, but because I think a lot of ordinary people underestimate how important record keeping actually is until the day something goes wrong. Those dusty folders in my closet saved me. Seriously. Old photos, survey paperwork, install receipts, timeline records. Without those documents, this story probably ends very different. Because memory alone rarely defeats institutional confidence. Paper does. That's why older generations kept everything in filing cabinets like Cold War archivists. They understood something we forgot during the digital age. Records are protection. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes authority figures back down quietly, not because they suddenly became ethical, but because continuing the fight creates more risk than admitting the mistake silently. That's why the paint disappeared overnight. No dramatic apology. No accountability meeting. No public correction. Just silence. The system protecting itself. And look, I don't even necessarily believe Dennis woke up intending to bully somebody. I think it's more complicated than that. I think he probably trusted the map too quickly, got emotionally committed to the conclusion, then doubled down because backing away in front of a homeowner feels humiliating for certain personalities. That happens everywhere. Managers, police officers, HOA board members, inspectors. The moment ego attaches itself to authority, objectivity starts bleeding out of the room. The lesson here is not hate authority. The lesson here is verify authority. Calmly, patiently, with documentation. Because evidence changes conversations faster than outrage ever will. And maybe the weirdest part of all this is that the fence itself became almost symbolic afterward. Every time I walk past those steel posts now, I don't just see property lines anymore. I see how fragile certainty really is in modern systems. One inaccurate overlay almost rewrote 12 years of reality because nobody bothered to slow down and physically check the markers in the dirt. That should concern people more than it does. Especially now. Everything's becoming automated, digitized, algorithmic, remotely processed by systems most ordinary people never fully understand. And while technology absolutely makes life easier in some ways, it also creates this dangerous illusion that data must automatically be correct because a computer displayed it confidently. But computers inherit human mistakes all the time. Bad inputs, old records, misaligned layers, incomplete updates. Then somebody downstream treats those errors like objective truth. That's exactly how small bureaucratic mistakes become expensive personal disasters. So yeah, the fence is still standing. Exactly where it always was. And every now and then Wade still drives past the property a little slower than necessary, probably wondering how that whole thing collapsed so fast. We don't really talk anymore. Fine by me. But if there's one thing I hope people take away from this story, it's this. When somebody in power pressures you to move fast, slow the situation down. Ask questions. Request documents. Verify timelines. Check records yourself. Because confidence is not proof. Paper trails matter. And sometimes the difference between losing your property rights and protecting them comes down to one very boring skill that almost nobody values anymore. Keeping receipts.